Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Tufts 8th Annual Civil Military Relations Conference, Nation Building and Peacekeeping in the 21st Century. My name is Jackson Lubke, and I'm one of the co-directors for CMRC this year. We are very excited to see the discussion and remarks on modern-day state-building efforts and peacekeeping. While the issue of nation building is not a new one, it is a particularly important one in the modern day as our nation and the international community continues to discuss the necessity of international military interventions and peacekeeping. As we've seen from regions such as Afghanistan, the Balkans, even back to post-World War II Germany and Japan, nation building has been an important international objective and hot topic for both the USA and the world. It's difficult to overstate the impact that these efforts have had both on the American people and the residents of these regions. We'd like to once again thank both the students from all across the United States for attending, as well as the distinguished experts who have agreed to share their insights with us amidst their busy schedules. Thus, without further ado, Simon will introduce our keynote speaker.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Simon, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Susan L. Woodward, a professor of political science at the Graduate Center of the City of University of New York. A specialist on the Balkans, her current research focuses on the transition from civil war to peace, international security, and state failure, and post-war state building. She has additionally worked with the United Nations, with the United Protection Forces in Croatia in 1994, and as a consultant to many groups such as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the Department of Defense. Today, she will be presenting on nation building and its importance today. So without further ado, Susan Woodward.
Thank you, Simon. It's lovely to be here, everyone. I wish I could see you. My first encounter with the term nation building as applied to contemporary international politics was in Beijing, China, in June 2006, when I was giving a seminar to the American Studies Institute of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. I was there to discuss the concept of failed states as what was then called the preeminent threat to American security by the US National Security Strategy of 2002. And I quote, "The United States today is threatened less by conquering states than we are by weak and failing states," unquote. Also in 2005, the new president of the World Bank identified what he called failed states as the preeminent threat to the international financial system. This concept of failed states, later called fragile states to be a bit more diplomatic, became the justification and definition for international intervention in the domestic affairs of a country at the time. Some of you may know that I wrote an entire book criticizing that concept and its ideology. But one of the Chinese scholars at this seminar asked me about this term nation building, because he said President George W. Bush was now using it to define American policy toward Iraq. I had to admit that that was not at all the goal or even the policy of that American intervention in Iraq, and that I was actually sure that President Bush and his administration had no idea what nation building meant, but they probably meant state building. In a 1994 interview with McGeorge Bundy, the former special assistant on national security affairs to Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, in the Brown Journal of World Affairs, the author, Peter Skoblik, identified, quote, "nation building as the promotion of economic and political institutions in a country so as to promote stability." He then added that students of the Cold War often cite nation building as a method that was used to bring countries into the US camp. Thus, searching for a historical precedent for American policies immediately after the Cold War, he asked Bundy, how did nation building fit into the framework of Kennedy's goals? Was it, for example, a concept that evolved out of Walt Rustow's theories of economic development? Bundy's answer, and I quote, "Let me first say that the phrase nation building is new to me. I don't remember the phrase. I don't think you'll find it in Kennedy's words," unquote. And indeed, President George W. Bush himself refused to characterize the US intervention in Iraq as nation building until developments on the ground were not going as the US hoped. The election campaign platform in 2000 of both Bush and his foreign policy advisor, soon to become National Security Advisor and later Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, was a scathing criticism of the idea of nation building. In 2001, in discussing our invasion in Afghanistan, Donald Rumsfeld declared, quote, "Our job is about killing bad guys, so we're not going to get involved in nation building," unquote. Yet after 8 years of American foreign policy focused primarily on the Iraq invasion, Condoleezza Rice made a total reversal, arguing that what she called as, and now I quote her, "the changed international environment where globalization strengthens some states and exposes and exacerbates the failings of others. It was now vital to our," she said, "national security to do just that, to ensure states are willing and able to meet the full range of their sovereign responsibilities, both beyond their borders and within them." Notice the difference in what she calls nation building. But by 2008, Rice even announced a plan for a civilian response corps of the US Agency for International Development and 7 other executive departments of state: agriculture, commerce, health and human services, homeland security, justice and treasury, plus American engineers, city planners, and judges, professionals who have the skills that the governments need to do the work of, quote her again, "saving states the US classifies as failing and to complement and assist our military forces," unquote. In 2009, after President Obama agreed to a surge of US troop numbers to Afghanistan, the general behind that policy, David Petraeus, was asked by the House Armed Services Committee whether the US was engaged in nation building. He replied, "We are indeed." For political scientists, the history of nation building is very richly studied. It focuses primarily on national integration or the agendas of anti-colonial emancipation and the creation of post-colonial independent political orders. It is worth noting that this process, especially in the West in the 19th century, was extremely violent. Take 3 examples. Eugen Weber's very celebrated book on the homogenizing policies in France called From Peasants into Frenchmen, or the policies of Italian unification as a process of royal conquest and brutal military campaign, governed by northern administrators and carpetbaggers, to use the term that Sidney Tarrow gave. You'll notice his reference to Reconstruction after the Civil War in the United States, with military rule, resistance to reintegration, and eventually Jim Crow laws and practices, and the Ku Klux Klan. In post-colonial African states beginning in the late 1950s, until the wars of national liberation that only end in the early 1990s, the result was almost uniformly one-party or one-party dominant systems. Take 2 such examples, Uganda and South Africa. They are still going through the violent processes. We can add Ethiopia this month. But all of these cases were domestically driven, most often a result of a military victory for one side, or what Jeremy Weinstein at Stanford University calls, for the 1990s, autonomous recovery. That is, no external intervention. The category to which the Chinese scholar was referring is that of international interventions since the early 1990s, that is, in a post-Cold War era. In this post-1990s case, I would argue that there are 2 main actors: the United Nations to authorize such interventions, and the United States as the sole surviving superpower, as it was called at the time of unipolarity. I have already spoken about the United States at the time. The United Nations would never call it nation building, and even rejected the more common term of state building. It insisted and still insists on the term peace building. But as we stand today, both actors, the US and the UN, are facing the consequences of failure. For the United States, the current conditions in Afghanistan, on top of Iraq, Libya, and Somalia, cannot be called a success. The celebrated Irish writer Fintan O'Toole, in a recent review of a book called The Afghanistan Papers by the Washington Post team and Carter Malkasian's book, The American War in Afghanistan, goes so far as to propose that the problem was not whether Afghans were fit for democracy, but whether the democratic values were strong enough in the United States to do such nation building in Afghanistan. He goes on, and I quote, "Critics of the war argued that the US could not create a polity in its own image on the far side of the world. The tragic truth is that in many ways it did exactly that," unquote. Nonetheless, the headline of an article in the Christian Science Monitor on September 16th this year was, quote, "Why end of Afghan war is not end of US-led nation building." Staff writer Howard LaFranchi explains, and I quote, "The impetus to export democracy and social norms is in Americans' DNA. It will be back, experts predict," unquote. One clue he proposes is the naming of Samantha Power as the head of the US Agency for International Development, USAID, and even giving her a position on the National Security Council. LaFranchi goes on to cite former diplomat James Dobbins, who had vast experience in American interventions in the last 30 years. You probably all know that, saying, and I quote again from Dobbins, "Highly negative assessment of nation building should be reserved for the regime change versions and forced entry operations that require heavy boots on the ground," unquote, in hostile environments. But Dobbins goes on, and I quote, "There's another version that has often involved peacekeeping in the aftermath of conflict and is more about assisting a country in moving on, satisfying basic needs, and developing the institutions that enable people to build better lives." As he adds, the Balkans, Panama, I don't know why Panama, and Sierra Leone. That, Dobbins goes on to say, is a form of nation building with a pretty good batting average, unquote. While I have written an entire book to demonstrate how wrong that conclusion is, and I can add a great deal of detail about the Bosnian case, it is worth noting that these are peacekeeping operations under the mandate and organization of the United Nations, not the United States. United Nations peacekeeping operations are almost a mirror opposite to American interventions because they begin with a negotiated ceasefire among warring parties, at the very least, and more often with a negotiated end to the fighting with a peace agreement. The UN mission is then established to help the parties implement that agreement. Some early successes in El Salvador and Mozambique illustrate well that mission to demilitarize politics, as Terence Lyons argues, including military observers, unarmed by the way, to ensure the parties' credible commitments to their agreement. A program of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, DDR, and assistance to the warring parties to transform into political parties and participate in electoral politics. But over time, expectations for such international missions became ever larger, not only continuing humanitarian aid, but also refugee repatriation, return of the internally displaced, human rights, rule of law, security sector reform of the military and the police, transitional justice, post-conflict reconstruction, economic reform, by which they mean creating or strengthening a market economy, the administrative apparatus of a liberal democracy, support to civil society, overall what we now call state building. These complex multi-dimensional operations are not only functionally complex, but organizationally so as well. Each of these tasks is done by a separate organization, and each organization has its own ideology, standing operating procedures, and insistence on autonomy. Repeated calls for coordination, then what were called integrated missions, reflect that reality. The research literature on these missions, particularly when described as state-building operations, and commonly by scholars liberal internationalism, is almost uniformly critical, demonstrating that their results actually undermine the state and certainly do not provide the justice, human rights guarantees, economic development, and employment promised. Although there is some dispute about the numbers, a resumption of war and the need for a new peacekeeping intervention reoccurs in between 30 to 50% of the peace building cases. Thus, for the United Nations, the last 10 years since 2015 have been agonizing efforts to admit the failures of more than 3 decades of peacekeeping operations and to infuse new life with a series of reform commissions and proposals. While the United Nations and the organizations involved are better at admitting these failings than is the United States, the proposals, as I discuss and analyze at length in my book, The Ideology of Failed States, are always to call for more resources and greater organizational capacity for the many intervening organizations involved, not to change what they're doing, or especially to find a way to put local actors in charge and play only a supportive role. No less an international actor on these matters than Lakhdar Brahimi, whose commission wrote the first review for reform of peacekeeping operations in 2000, who negotiated the Bonn Agreement for Afghanistan in 2001 that enabled that international intervention, and who was the first head of the UN mission to Afghanistan to implement that agreement, despite its additional burden of a simultaneous American counterinsurgency war against the Taliban, alongside the UN's International Security Assistance Force that was composed almost entirely of NATO forces, each with their own provincial reconstruction, assignment, and area, is quite deliberate. Brahimi is quite deliberate, even in an interview last month, in criticizing both US and UN interventions for ignoring national actors, for importing personnel with high salaries and no accountability, importing even materials that could more easily and cheaply be provided locally, and especially for dismissing the capacity of local actors instead. As former Liberian President Amos Sawyer has long criticized, not assessing first what capacities are already available locally. The joint assistance missions run by the World Bank and the UN to design their development plan for each country being intervened identify what outsiders say they need, not what locals can already do and should be utilized. Both the UN and US operations are roundly criticized with no positive results for treating the target country as a tabula rasa, an empty space with no capacity, no local institutions, no history at all. The World Bank even refers to these interventions as a golden opportunity to implant its preferred institutions and policies. By now you may be saying, so what happened to nation building? In part, the answer is what I told the Chinese scholar, that George W. Bush did not know what that was, and that I do not know why he chose that term, except that people inside the Beltway, that is the Washington military and diplomatic establishment, such as the RAND Corporation, that's James Dobbins, Francis Fukuyama in his book, and even the legal scholar at Harvard, Noah Feldman, based on his role in the Iraq invasion, they all use that term. For Jason Brownlee, whose 2007 review of a series of books on American interventions that he calls were spawned by the US invasion and occupation of Iraq, he titles, Can America Nation Build? The universe of these cases, as Jackson has already mentioned, of nation building by the US include not only Iraq and Afghanistan, but Germany and Japan, more than 30 military expeditions in Latin America, the Philippines, Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, then Korea, the Dominican Republic, Vietnam, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Somalia, Haiti. Brownlee's answer to the question, can American nation build, aside from noting that these studies of US interventions and our own public knowledge focus almost entirely on Germany and Japan after World War II, thus ignoring the most frequent ones, which were in Latin America, as Greg Grandin has shown in his book, Empire's Workshop, and including renewed counterinsurgency in Central America in the 1990s. Plus, as I've already mentioned, the covert ones in Iran and Guatemala, then the Philippines, Korea, Dominican Republic, and South Vietnam by France and the United States for 10 years before our invasion. Brownlee's answer is that the US has done best where it has done least, refurbishing existing local institutions rather than attempting to construct new ones. Taking this local focus from Brahimi and Brownlee, I would like to argue that we need to understand what nation building is and why nation building after wartime, especially after an internal civil war, but also after a national independence struggle, is actually extremely important. The issue of who does it is also critical. In a recent review of two new books by two distinguished scholars on the American Revolution and early state, Joseph Ellis and Gordon Wood, the reviewer Richard Stengel summarizes their arguments as follows, and I quote, "There was nothing inevitable about the creation of the United States. The United States singular, that is, a continental nation state with a central government, rather than these United States plural, a collection of small, quarrelsome quasi-republics connected by a weak treaty of friendship. In fact, the path to the nation as we know it was highly implausible. For the 13 states at the time of the revolution, the quest for independence was not just freedom from an imperial Britain, but independence from one another," and end quote. A commenter on these two studies then added, "But it took a civil war to turn the US from a union to a nation." In the political science literature on democratization, Dankwart Rustow's contribution in 1971 remains essential reading. Before he analyzes the three stages toward creating democracy from a non-democratic regime, Rustow argues that there is a precondition of the move toward democracy, a sense of national unity taken for granted, not only physical boundaries of the community, but also consciousness of being a political community, a nation. Nationhood must precede democratic development. In my research in peace-building missions, I repeatedly heard from my interviewees how important nation building was for them, including its basis in the domestic legitimacy for a new state that is critical to its stability and effectiveness. Yet they raised this because of their frustration with the international mission. And here the two actors, the UN mission leadership and the United States both, prevented this task. I give you three examples from Timor-Leste, Haiti, and Liberia, and then go on to identify what I see the obstacles to this path. In Timor-Leste, Emilia Pires, a longtime activist for Timorese independence in Portugal and then in Australia, but at the time of this comment I'm giving you, was Minister of Finance for an independent Timor-Leste, 2007 to 2015, describes what she thought they needed once they had won the goal of a 24-year struggle for independence from Indonesia. And I quote, "to know where we are going," unquote. That next step was nation building. But the donors, led by the World Bank and the United States, insisted, she continues, that they had to have a national development plan first and fast so that a donors conference could be held and pledges received. The Timor-Leste plan, which the Timorese themselves, had drawn up even before the referendum on independence and entry of the UN mission, was to survey the entire country first and create what she called Vision 2020, which they would then print in Tetum, not in Portuguese, and distribute to the population before the donors conference. They had already obtained funding, I think it was from the Irish, to print this survey and get it delivered from Australia. But this would take too long, the World Bank and US authorities insisted. Instead, the externally designed and organized joint assessment mission for, again, this externally defined development plan was done immediately. 3 months total, but only 2 weeks spent in the country itself. Then Pires continues, we were only given like 7 months for the development plan because the donors said that if we do not have a plan, then they would not give us money for the next 3 years to finance our budget. We still insisted that first of all, we needed to know where we were going. Instead, we never had time to come together as a nation and say, this is what we want to do. We were pushed and pulled into state building, building institutions. But without a vision, how can you do this? Because you do not have a common goal. But they thought that was a bit of a waste of time. I add from Timorese civil society activist, Guteriano Nicolau Neves, of the Timor-Leste NGO Lau Hamutuk, wonderful NGO. He put it this way in July 2006, and I quote, our nationalist spirit, which was very high during the resistance, has been eroded by the nation building process because of a lack of our participation. And in the end, our sense of ownership of our state has been whittled away little by little. So the aid did not enforce our independence, but sometimes destroyed our hopes, unquote. In Haiti, Sabine Manigat, a highly distinguished Haitian journalist, had the same complaint, that the country needed a national dialogue before the international community pressured for quick elections, what the late head of political affairs in the UN mission calls hit and run democracies. But the internationals showed no interest. Liberian experts at a brainstorming at the United Nations in New York in the spring of 2005, including Amos Sawyer, president of the interim government of national unity from November 1990 to March 1994, also argued strongly on the necessity of a countrywide dialogue to develop a sense of what he called, I quote, a shared community. In Liberia, prior to the first post-war elections scheduled by the UN mission, UNMIL, for that October, several months later, 2005. To interrupt a 25-year cyclical pattern producing repeated violence and governmental breakdown in Liberia, Sawyer argued, it was also essential to reduce the powers of the presidency, particularly in the economy, but unchanged since the late 19th century. And this could only be achieved by a national conference and reform commission before the next president was chosen. His plea fell on deaf ears at the UN mission in Monrovia, which insisted that elections had to go ahead on their schedule. In these three stories, I see three obstacles to real nation building that I want to highlight. The first and most easily remedied if the negative consequences for long-term peace and stability are recognized is the UN mission's insistence on early elections before such a national dialogue among the local population, locally led. My main explanation for this insistence is that the principle of national sovereignty in the UN Charter requires local invitation, local request, and consent before a UN mission can be mandated and deployed. Who can provide that consent? A legitimately elected government. The rush to early elections, in other words, has nothing to do with democracy. Indeed, the research shows such early elections to be counterproductive to the democratization process in the first year or so after war, largely because it rewards those who control the means of violence and have not yet transformed into political parties appropriate to an end to the war. It legitimizes the wartime leaders, and which has been seen to be truly damaging from Bosnia to Burundi. The sole reason for elections, I propose, is to enable the United Nations mission to deploy and operate, to have politicians considered by elections legitimate to work with, to have their needed interlocutors, those seen by outsiders as sovereign representatives of their people's will. The second obstacle to genuine support for a domestic process of nation building, and to me the most serious and damaging, is the primary goal of the United States in these cases. In alliance with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, their goal, the United States goal, is not to do nation building or state building at all, but to create externally oriented market economies. Although the bank calls this good governance, the actual policies and criteria reflect a doctrine of a minimal state whose only functions are those considered by neoliberal economists to be necessary for markets to work, and along the way to be able to repay World Bank and IMF loans. Thus, institutional capacities for macroeconomic stabilization, liberalization of foreign economic relations, especially trade and export promotion, good financial management, protections for foreign investors, an independent central bank. Not surprisingly, their main interlocutor in the new government is the Minister of Finance. So important that the IMF ensures that the IMF choose the Minister of Finance so that the IMF's economic and political ideology is already accepted by that person. Essential to their mentality is the perception of these countries as in crisis, for which their actions, the bank, the IMF, and the United States, these external actors, in other words, require speed. As Amelia Perez's Timorese study illustrates best, a local emphasis on nation building and national dialogue first gets in their way. The Timorese also held multiple pre-referendum meetings, including more than 100 doctors, intellectuals, academics, NGOs, to design the structure of their post-independence public service, which the UN mission then simply ignored. And the World Bank then designed its own government for Timor-Leste, according to the sectoral organization of the government based on the World Bank's assessment mission and doctrine. I think it is worth considering what market radicalism has done to the social structure in the US alone and the resulting political polarization, the opposite of nation building or integration. The third obstacle I propose is an American obsession with seeing all of these internal conflicts as ethnic. In the case of Afghanistan, they will even use the word tribal. While I can tell you at length why this is wrong, and a vast literature on the causes of civil war to support my argument that that's wrong, what matters today is the consequences. The populations in Iraq and Afghanistan both complained bitterly about the American interpretation of their situation, adamant that they, Iraqis and Afghanis, were self-consciously proud and loyal nations, knew who they were as a nation, and criticized the American perception of their conflict as ethnically based and sectarian, and the intervention as splintering them. In Iraq, an op-ed by Leslie Gelb, the journalist and at the time president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and then Senator Joe Biden, proposed that Iraq should be reorganized around 3 ethno-religious identities along the lines, they argued, of the Dayton Accord for Bosnia-Herzegovina, as if that was successful. The US intervention also paid particular attention to the Kurdish population and a decentralized state in Iraq to accommodate them, even though we know that the Kurds themselves are internally divided politically. In Afghanistan, the US directed Bonn Agreement in 2001 insisted on not including the Taliban and then most Pashtuns. And in December that year, when the Taliban asked to sign a ceasefire and be included in the Bonn Agreement that was being signed at the time, and thus the formation of the post-invasion permanent government, Donald Rumsfeld simply refused. We are now facing the consequences. Nicholas Sambanis also demonstrates that US counterinsurgency policies inadvertently activate ethnic or sectarian cleavages, and by reifying these social divisions, undermine the integrative institutions that cultivate a common national identity, institutions that he argues are critical to the stability of post-war transitions. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Clinton administration took the side of one of the 3 parties to the war, the Bosnian Muslims, who at that time in August 1993 changed their name to Bosniaks, for reasons I can explain, but without defending Bosnia-Herzegovina as a whole. In doing so, they deprived the Bosniaks of their only basis for political survival, that of Bosnia. Then the American negotiations to end its civil war under Richard Holbrooke designed a constitutional system based on power sharing among the 3 so-called ethno-national groups claiming sovereignty, and thereby excluded all those Bosnians who had a mixed heritage, neither Croat, Serb, nor Bosniak, often for many generations, in fact, excluded all those who identified as Yugoslav, and excluded many minorities, starting with Jews, despite their historically critical role in Sarajevo since they left Spain. In other words, ethnically defined constitution, which has created a total stalemate for almost 30 years. At the same time, all the efforts by the US government since the Dayton Accord was signed in 1995 have been to reverse the extensive decentralization of the state in that peace agreement, with pressures over and over for centralizing reforms, still to support the political position of that one Bosnian group, the Bosniaks, even though that centralizing pressure was intensely disliked by the 2 others in the Dayton Agreement, and thus provoking their political reaction against the centralized government. Similarly, the large number of socioeconomic activities supported by external actors and their monies, especially American, ever since 1995, such as in media, education, NGOs, have all attempted to force multi-ethnic activity, mainly by what they support financially, but also rhetorically. This pressure to work together as ethnic groups in multi-ethnic activity has provoked reaction by many Bosnians of all identities, especially the younger generation, because it presumes ethno-national identity to be the only one that matters. and is not pro-Bosnian regardless of ethno-national identity. Like the centralizing project, the result is to keep the war alive, even if it is not violent currently, rather than to move beyond it and find a path to pragmatic national integration and sovereignty. In conclusion, in political science, our terms, what we call concepts, matter. We cannot build any new knowledge, let alone useful knowledge, without precise, carefully defined concepts and distinctions about what the concept includes or excludes and what it means. A problem arises, however, when the term is commonly used in public discourse, everyday discussions, policy worlds, when it is, as the term nation building is, a political term, and worse, when it actually means nothing to those who say they are doing it, diplomats, policymakers, and external interveners in the cases of contemporary interventions. The world of scholarship on nation building is about the breakup of colonial empires and the assertion of national independence and national sovereignty against outsiders, whereas this policy world is about the reverse. Outsiders intervening to bring peace, or at least stability, so they say, where the conflict is internal, and the outsiders think they can repair this domestic conflict somehow. Of course, peace and stability are like nation building too. Slogans without concrete definition and projects that have not proven successful in achieving those goals. Everything we know about externally imposed goals, such as democracy or even so-called reconciliation, have been counterproductive, regularly creating even more divisions than outsiders found when they arrive, and often provoking a nationalist reaction against the outsiders, but not in a way that will heal internal divisions, as we see currently in Afghanistan. I found the comment made this September 28th by retired General Austin, now Secretary of Defense, to a congressional hearing about the disaster unfolding in Afghanistan and revealed by the US withdrawal. Quote, "We built a state, but we could not build a nation." If we had a clearer understanding of what nation building means and might be, and why it is important, perhaps we might have more success with our interventions. One example might be the research by Nicholas Sambanis and Moses Shile on parochialism, for example, that shows very clearly why, quote, "Nation building is important for avoiding internal conflict because national identification always discourages fighting," unquote. Paige Fortner's work on why classic Chapter 6 UN peacekeeping operations, in contrast to the newer complex multidimensional and often even peace enforcement operations, in fact work best, and I think they should be revisited. But all such new knowledge would still require adjustment in the actual objectives and programs of an immense number of organizations and their staff who now live off these interventions and are highly institutionalized. I find that highly unlikely. And even more, my proposal for putting local actors in charge, appreciating local capacities, and outsiders playing a supportive, not leading role, rather than ignoring local ideas and initiatives. I am pessimistic about that possibility too, but I can be a bit more optimistic about scholarship. If we realize that this concept of nation building in the contemporary period, focused mainly on countries emerging from civil war, has real meaning, then we might get research focused on empirical cases, variation among them in practice and outcome, why it matters to ending civil wars and building peace, and how international interventions harm or help those processes. That could be a start. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Woodward, for your wonderful presentation. It was really interesting, and I'm sure everyone here learned a lot. So everyone in the audience, we're going to now move into our Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function in the chat to ask them, and we'll spend a bit of time going through that. While we give you a minute to do that, I'll ask you just a question of my own that I had throughout your talk, which is just that, how do you see, I understand that your outlook is very pessimistic, but how do you see the situation in Afghanistan changing President Biden's outlook on nation building into the future, and how that might impact US foreign policy going forward for the rest of his administration?
Well, I haven't heard President Biden say anything about nation building. I do think he's been fairly clear that it's time for the US, if not to stop entirely these kinds of interventions, to do a lot more thinking beforehand. So in that case, I think that what's going on in Afghanistan is only going to reinforce that view of his. Although, as I say, by putting Samantha Power, who's very much an interventionist, and she argues for human rights, but of course, what have I said about the consequences for human rights of these interventions? You can't do just human rights alone. It comes with a lot of other things. Putting her as the head of USAID and on the National Security Council is, as that article in the Christian Science Monitor says, is sort of a contradictory impulse. So what do you think, actually? Do you want to give me your view?
Well, I'm not sure I have as much knowledge base to do it off of as much as you, but I took a class on this last year, and I guess I take a maybe slightly more optimistic viewpoint, in that I remember reading about sort of, I guess I think that Biden will hopefully, or the policymakers will see the sort of failures in Afghanistan as a sort of wake up call, insofar that their actions, and that the actions that donor states, and particularly that the US does in these fragile and failed states, has consequences for their ability to have government and sustainable government in the future. And that, you can't build a politically legitimate government in a world where the US controls everything about its economy and its society. And so I'm not sure if anything will change, but I do think that the forefront and the sort of contemporary understanding of the failures in Afghanistan bring these ideas into more contemporary understandings.
Excellent, excellent.
Okay, our first question is from the chat, which is, what do you believe the current role of US is in Afghanistan, and is there and if there is any role for the US in situations like Afghanistan going forward?
Well, I think the second part of that question is already what you, Simon, and I have been talking about. As for the US role in Afghanistan, I think there's no role. I mean, it is true that non-governmental organizations that do humanitarian aid, work in education, they will continue to be on the ground, and many of them are American, but they're not government sponsored. So the extent, I think the US, there's just no way. I mean, who knows? Politics is unpredictable. It's based on uncertainty and contingencies of who would be the next president. But I don't see the US doing anything in Afghanistan. The issue right now is it is doing something in Afghanistan by withholding monies that the IMF has and the US has, and then so the question is, what are we going to do? Are we going to assist the Taliban? Are we going to wait till the war between Taliban and the ISS plays out, which is going to be many years? So we still, in fact, are going to be called on for a role in that sense of what kind of recognition of a Taliban government and economic assistance going forward is going to be. And I can't foresee what's going to happen there.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think it would be very unlikely that the US would, at least politically, would be able to support the Taliban in really any capacity. But I'll take the next question while we wait for some more questions to pop up in the chat. But I think, how do you see, like, from your talk, like, clearly the sort of concept of nation building has become vacuous and really lost a lot of its important meaning. Do you think that this is sort of a result of ignorance by policymakers, or more of a sort of actual perverse, incentive for policymakers to use a term like nation building, which is vacuous, in order to further some political end? And if you think that it's not just a result of ignorance, how do you see that like occurring, and why?
That's an extremely interesting question, and I wish I had a good answer for you. It's sort of like democracy and motherhood and apple pie. There are these sort of words that are pulled out. I think it is ignorance. But the next step would be, so why would they choose that word rather than something else? Because political rhetoric has a purpose always. So I'm not quite sure what Bush and Rice thought they were saying when they said nation building. And I think they thought of it as a very positive, supportive thing, and indeed supportive of the local actors, even though that's not at all what was going on. I'd love to hear more discussion on your part and with your other students about why you think they chose that term.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a great answer for that. It's something that I definitely asked myself a lot last year when I took a class on this. But if anyone has any specific comments, feel free to say that in the chat and I can read it out. But I will move on to the next question because we have another one in the chat, which is that sometimes in the case of post-intervention, foreign aid flows into failing states and often dwarfs any other source of revenue. However, this aid often circumvents local government institution and often has different goals than the local government officials. Does this mean that foreign aid is counterproductive to nation building and state building efforts?
Well, first of all, the person who asked that question used the term failed states, and they have to know that they're talking to Susan Woodward, who wrote a whole book saying there is no such thing as failed states. All right, that it's a term used by outsiders to say that country doesn't have the institutions or capacities that we need to do our work, including foreign aid. It doesn't have anything to do with what is necessary for those people to govern themselves and have prosperity and so forth. So please don't use the term failed states. I think it's that the literature is pretty critical also. I'm pessimistic because of, not just because of what I've seen, but the scholarship I read. So I'm talking about real results of what doesn't work and why it's critical. The same thing on foreign aid. It's highly critical. I think that there's no question that we live in a world of global capitalism, that the international financial system is its basis, and therefore the World Bank and the IMF are not going to go away in terms of their lending capacity and their role. It would be nice if we could get them to change the kinds of conditionalities that they insist on, which we know are counterproductive and only make countries more indebted. But I don't think we're going to get away from a world where there's no, at least foreign loans to states. But there are heterodox economists who have extremely good ideas about how one can give aid that will actually help develop a country. So the aid would still be coming from the outside, but it would be for different kinds of policies. And it would be nice if people paid more attention to those. It used to be that development economists were very important in the field of economics, but that's no longer true. Now we call them heterodox.
Yeah, great. Just a reminder, everyone, if you want to ask a question, any and all questions are appreciated. Please use the Q&A function. I guess I'll take the next one while we wait for some more questions to come in, which is, I remember reading a lot about, reading Charles Tilley's very influential work on understanding nation building and in the context of war making, and sort of how sort of war making is an essential component of state building. Do you see that to be the case in sort of nation building? I guess maybe not nation building efforts, but in the nations which have successfully or unsuccessfully been able to reduce their fragility or sort of create better forms of governments. Do you see the Charles Tilley's like ideas of war making and state building come to the forefront, or do you think that it's not necessarily like an empirical fact of this?
Well, it's so interesting because, of course, Tilley's work was on early modern Europe.
Yeah.
And in that case, war was of two kinds. It was territorial warfare between, let's say, between Prussia and France, between countries. And so the state building capacity to mount armies, to get to tax people, to get soldiers, all of that. So that's what he meant, was in order to fight wars, you had to build states. It was an outcome. It wasn't a goal to build states. It was an outcome of war fighting. And then the second kind of war was internal rivals. So that aspect of war is still what's going on. Look at what's going on in Ethiopia as we speak, right? And so to a certain extent, I think that's more likely to continue, not because that's what nation building needs, but that will be the outcome. Although, as I said, with Uganda and South Africa, we still don't have an outcome. So the violence is continuing. On the other hand, the kind of wars that Tilly was analyzing are not what we see elsewhere. So there's a very rich literature saying, well, the Tilly argument applies to early modern Europe, but not, let's say, to the Middle East. In the Middle East, all of the war is external intervention, largely by the US. So we can see that's certainly, look at Iraq, look at Syria. We don't, that's certainly not Lebanon. It's not leading to national integration. And then the literature, Miguel Centeno's work on Latin America is really interesting, where he says the Tilly argument doesn't apply there because all the wars were really small wars. So the state building process was quite different. But it is interesting because except for what we're going through now with indigenous politics saying, wait a minute, we haven't been heard, we want autonomy, that we haven't had the kind of divisive internal civil war politics in most of Latin America. Well, on the other hand, if you go back to Greg Grandin's work on Latin America, I mentioned Empire's Workshop, there's again, like the Middle East, a question of, well, is this really because the United States kept intervening over and over again with military and counterinsurgency? So I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely, it's an interesting question. I guess my follow-up to that would be just a little bit more specifically, like, under the way that I understand it, if it's a question of sort of, the way that I understand external interventions in sort of the nation building capacity is that the first and foremost goal is to end hostilities and then sort of engage in these sort of, externally focused, building, state building campaigns. Do you think that this is, due to Charles Tilly argument, counterproductive because it doesn't allow the conflict to sort of take its role in the purpose of nation building? Or do you see sort of the goal of, or do you see like external interventions as despite, perhaps undermining certain political forces within the country as sort of necessary?
Well, I don't have a single example of where the nation building and the way I've been talking about it today, where national integration and a sense of who we are results from an external intervention. I see none. The reason I mentioned Jason Brownlee's article is they're saying, okay, everyone says Germany and Japan were a success, but they were already nations. And all we did was build on the political institutions they already had. So I don't think I think it's an empirical question. Is it possible? But I have not seen one single case. The outcomes are all highly divisive. Now, it's interesting, if Donald Rumsfeld had allowed the Taliban, when it was very weak, small groups of people in the South around Kandahar, to be allowed to be a part of the Bonn Agreement, we would have, they really could have had Brahimi's notion of a light footprint. That was what he called, to have mainly locals in charge of the UN mission. We would not have had a UN counterinsurgency military campaign. You can imagine a huge scenario where the US intervention in the sense of the Bonn Agreement that ended the Taliban regime of the 90s, it might well have been one, I wouldn't say of nation building, but of restoring a nation in Afghanistan. But the history is the opposite. As Barnett Rubin writes, that decision by Donald Rumsfeld was the moment at which the US lost Afghanistan, December 2001.
For sure. All right, well, that's all the time that we have today. Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today, Dr. Woodward. Our next panel is on the role of the private sector in supporting international stability operations, and it starts at 11:30. In the chat, there will be links to the next panel and the IGL website for all of the conference information, and we'll see you all there. And just one more time, thanks you to Dr. Woodward for being our keynote speaker today, and we hope to see you all later today or tomorrow for the sim.
Thank you, Simon.